Give me the biggest name that won't be on any of your rosters this season.
It has to be Kevin Love, right? I've been burned by Kevin Love way too many times, including each of the last 2 years in very important leagues. He's played 25, 56, 22, 59, and 60 games over the last 5 seasons. He cannot be trusted. He's in a terrible situation in Cleveland. They have a rookie in Evan Mobley. They have a center who they just re-signed for $100 million in Jared Allen. They signed and traded for Lowry Markkanen. I think they want to get rid of Kevin Love. The problem is he makes too much money. It's a volatile situation. It's one that I am not touching whatsoever this season.
Yeah, and even if Kevin Love does get traded or bought out, he'll probably end up in a situation where he's not playing nearly as much. His usage could be lower. It could be like a Blake Griffin situation. So even at that point, he may not be 12-team relevant. How do you value Ben Simmons at this point if your draft is taking place, before he gets dealt?
I wish I had a great answer for this, but really it's impossible to say. Neither of these sides, the 76ers or Ben Simmons camp with Clutch Sports, have a ton of leverage right now. The Simmons camp at least is doing what it can to expedite this process, but everything we hear from the Sixers is that they're asking for an exorbitant price for a guy whose value simply is not what it was even 6 months ago. He played so poorly in that playoff series that teams are not going to be willing to give up blue chip assets to acquire a guy who has a ton of question marks. So if you're drafting right now, I think you have to prepare for the possibility of missed games. Simmons seems very comfortable with that, potentially forfeiting game checks, potentially, being away from the team to begin the regular season, which starts in less than a month.
And part of the equation here is that he's being dealt partially because, the fit in Philly is not good. It's one of the worst places he could theoretically play just in terms of basketball fit. Mm-hmm. So you have to also factor in, well, what if he gets traded somewhere where it's a great fit and he could have the best season of his career when he's actually on the court.
You don't want to be aggressive in targeting Ben Simmons, but I also don't think you want to let him continue to pass you by.
Of those players who have switched teams, what is one player who concerns you just in terms of his fantasy value? His addition to the team really tanks someone else's value.
Number one, Kyle Lowry. You have to consider the age. I think guys like LeBron James and Chris Paul almost set unrealistic standards for some of these veteran players.
Yeah, Lowry is someone who I just grabbed in the 6th round of a Raz Jam draft, and I didn't love it, but at the same time, when you're in the 6th round, a lot of the other options have plenty of question marks around them too. And I figured I'll take an established guy who, he's still going to hit a ton of threes. He's going to pass the ball really well.
DeMar DeRozan in Chicago. A lot of his value over the last couple of years since arriving in San Antonio has been derived from his assists. I mean, he handed out almost 7 assists per game last season. That's huge for a guy who really doesn't give you much on defense, doesn't give you anything from beyond the arc. It's free throw percentage, it's assists, and it's points with DeRozan. All 3 of those categories, I should say, could be in a little bit of jeopardy as he joins a team with a whole lot more talent around him than he had.
Yeah, it's kind of tough to say what his usage is going to be like alongside, other high usage ball handlers, essentially. Even Vucevic can handle the ball or operate from the high post and make some passes. The Bulls are a really shallow team. So I think when he's on the court, there are going to be a lot of situations where he's out there with a ton of other bench guys, a ton of other low usage guys, and he'll have the ball in his hands like he did a ton in San Antonio.
Kemba Walker arriving in New York. I mean, it's been a rough couple of years for Kemba as these knee issues have really kind of, impacted his career so negatively since he left Charlotte. But, I think they're going to be really careful with him, as Boston was last year. Kemba's somewhat of a stay away for me just because I think he misses a ton of games.
Who do you think is the most overrated point guard for fantasy?
Kyrie Irving came to mind just because of the injuries. But I want to go in a different direction. That's D'Angelo Russell of the Timberwolves. Like Kyrie, he has the injury concerns, maybe not quite to that same degree, but he's played fewer than 50 games in 3 of the last 4 seasons, and he just hasn't been all that effective outside of that one All-Star season in Brooklyn.
I agree. I think at this point, he is more of a name than, is his production. His name and his production don't necessarily correlate in fantasy. Who is the center that worries you the most?
Kristaps Porzingis, I think, is the number one name who comes to mind. And I don't think he really qualifies as overrated. It's just the injuries. Can you trust Kristaps Porzingis to give you more than 50 games? Mitchell Robinson on that list as well. Alex, you and I on our podcast, talked about Mitchell Robinson versus Nerlens Noel recently. And, we discovered Nerlens Noel has a much better block rate than Mitchell Robinson. Nikola Vucevic. Again, I hesitate to say he's overrated, but you look at the roster construction in Chicago, and I have some of the same questions for Vucevic that I have with DeMar DeRozan. You know, you're bringing in Lonzo Ball, you have a high usage star in Zach LaVine, and we did get to see a sample of LaVine and Vucevic playing together last season. It wasn't good.
I definitely agree with you on Vucevic. This is the most talented team he's ever been on. Yeah, it seems like there'll probably be fewer post-up opportunities for him. I can imagine a lot more pick and pops, especially with DeRozan on the court, who's not a great three-point shooter. Now, there's still going to be opportunities for him to touch the ball. I mean, plenty of athletes like, LaVine cutting to the basket for alley-oops and stuff like that. But I am worried about Robert Williams in the sense that I'm worried I won't get any of him in any of my drafts because his stock is so high. People are so amped up about Robert Williams potentially starting at center and seeing 30 minutes a game, being a top 30 fantasy player, that I'm just not going to end up with any of his stock come draft day. I'm worried that it's going to come to bite me.